Hi to everyone that is joining. I can see the participant list is growing, so we'll just give people another minute or so to join. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining and welcome to the last of our webinars in this series on the new Pearson English International Certificate. My name is Ben Cook. I'm one of the assessment managers at Pearson, and today I'm going to be talking about how we designed the online computer-based Pearson English International Certificate test. And the session will last for about an hour. We're going to be covering a few different topics. One, I'm just going to give you a very quick recap or an introduction to International Certificate for those who haven't joined the previous webinars, just to remind you of the purpose of the assessment and how it works, and then go into the detail around how we actually design the test. So we'll go through the process that we use, we develop items, we'll go through the different items in the test, and what's the purposes, what was the rationale for including those in the test. And then lastly, we'll spend a bit of time at the end talking about how the test is scored and the kind of reporting that we produce. And then lastly, there'll be time for questions. If you do have any questions as we're going through the presentation, please drop them into the Q&A and we can pick them up at the end. So as I said, we'll start with a sort of a very quick introduction to International Certificate. International Certificate is an assessment for 6 levels of proficiency. So that's from the CFR level A1 all the way up to CFR A2. And there are 6 tests, 1 for each level. And it accredits and certifies general English ability. Okay, so this is sort of everyday English, not specific to academic or business, but more of a general English proficiency. All 4 skills are tested in that one test, so slightly different to the paper-based version where you do have a separate speaking session. So we test all 4 skills, reading, writing, listening, and speaking in one session as you sit at the computer, and the total test time is between 1.5 and 2 hours long, depending on which level you're taking. It's an on-demand computer-based test, so you can choose what time, what date you want to take the test, and can be taken in a test center or at home using online proctoring. And you would have seen Carmen's session last week that went into more details around that online proctoring. There are a lot of similarities with the paper-based test, but there are also some differences, and we'll be talking about those differences as we go through the session today. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the test design and the development process, so you understand how we develop these items and the kind of review and all the quality controls that we have in place to ensure that this is a valid, reliable and fair test for test takers.
Sorry, can I interrupt just quickly? It's Sophia here. Hello. The audio is not always clear. It's kind of cutting in and out a little bit. I wondered if you have a separate headset that you could maybe use, just so we can make sure that everybody hears, because yeah, it's a little bit erratic.
Yep, no worries. Thanks, Sophia. I will just change my headset over.
Thank you.
Hopefully that's better.
Sounds good so far.
Okay, all right. That's useful. I'll talk about that a bit later when we come on to talking about speaking items and the best way to do the speaking when you come to the exam. So yeah, as I was saying, we'll be talking about how we develop the items. And this process that we're going to go through is true for all of our exams in Pearson. So although we're talking specifically about international certificate, we follow the same or a very similar process for all our tests. So the start of any test is the needs analysis. So this is where we go out and we talk to teachers, we talk to test takers, we talk to schools, universities, other institutions to really understand what do they want from a test, what's important, how is this test going to be used? And that might cover things such as the score reporting. What would be useful to see on a score report? It could be practical concerns like how long would you like the test to be? How would you like to access the test? It could be what would you like to actually be assessed in the test? Is it just grammar or is it a range of skills? So we spend a lot of time talking to all our customers, talking to potential customers about what they would like to see in the test. And we take all that feedback and we create a test specification. And this is kind of a key document in the process that outlines what is the test aiming to do? What's the construct of the test? What's the purpose? What's the aim? What's the outcomes of that testing process as well? And that test specification then leads into the item specification. And the item specification really goes into the detail of the different question types that we want to include in the exam and covers everything from what skills will those item types test to the detail around word counts, how long should that test, those individual items be, what's the topics that should be included. All of that detail goes into the item specifications. And those two documents form the core of developing the test and developing the items. And those specifications are reviewed and they're signed off so that everyone is happy and online. So we're always referring back to these two key documents that really define what the test will look like. And once that's been completed and we have those documents signed off and ready to go, we then start the item writing process. And this can be quite a long process depending on how many items we need to write. But we recruit and we train item writers to create the items for the test. And all our item writers are very, very experienced teachers. Very often they've got experience in assessment and writing items. They're very familiar with the CFR levels. So again, it's very important when they're writing the items, they have a good understanding of what an A2 candidate is, for example. I apologize if you can hear my dog barking in the background. I think the postman's just arrived. Once we've recruited those item writers, we then train them and we come back to these specifications to show them what the items should look like. We give them advice and support about where to find sources for authentic text, for example. We go through all those item specifications so that they're very clear on what the purpose and the outcome should be when it comes to writing. When they actually start the item writing, they do this in teams, they have a lot of support, they have team leaders who will give them advice and review their items. So again, we're ensuring that everything we're doing and everything the item writers are doing is coming back to these specifications. What we want to ensure is that all the items are consistent. We don't want items that are different across different tests. Those items then go into a review process. They'll be reviewed by the item writers themselves. So again, within their team, they'll be reviewing each other's items to ensure that they fit the specifications. We've also got a whole different set of reviewers that look at these items and they will sign them off and say, yeah, we can accept that item, or no, that item is too easy or too difficult, or is not relevant to the test. It's more business English than general English, so cannot be used. And at the outcome of that review is to say, yes, we accept the item, or no, we don't, or possibly this needs some work. It needs to be revised. Perhaps it's too long, it needs to be shortened, or vice versa. It then comes back to Pearson for internal review. And again, we go through the same process of checking that everything in those items is fitting our guidelines and our standards that we've laid out in the test and item specifications. So already you can see that these items are being reviewed multiple times, and that's really to ensure the quality of our test, that the test is fair, that every test taker is going to be getting the same experience, and that the results that we report are valid and reliable. All these things are key with any assessment. Once those items have been reviewed and signed off internally, we then have to move on to the practicalities of actually creating these items. So that would be things like the audio. We have a lot of listening item types, as we'll see in this test. So we need to go to the recording studio, or we might need to, if we're using authentic audio, many of our items use authentic audio, we need to source that. We need to ensure that the quality is good enough to use in the test. A lot of our item types also have images and pictures. So again, we need to either commission those and have those images designed, or if they are authentic images, we need to source those and ensure that the quality again is clear. We want to, these images are on screen. Are they sharp? We don't want blurry images or images that are too small and will cause issues for test takers. Once we have all the different pieces that we need from the media, we can then move into the publishing stage. And this is where we do things like we lay out the item. Every single item type, every question should have the same layout. We don't want any inconsistencies in our test. We need to make sure that we've proofread these items. Again, we don't want spelling mistakes. We want to make sure that everything is clear for test takers. We need to make sure that the instructions are clear and consistent. We need to make sure, as I say, the layout, the audio is working, that the images are there, they're the right size, they're in the right position, and that's all part of that publishing phase. We then move into the calibration, and this could happen slightly earlier. It's sort of a separate but integral part of the process, and that's to make sure that the items are not too difficult or not too easy for that level. So that if you're taking, for example, CFR B1, the international certificate test, that the items are all at around B1. It's going to be a fair test for that B1 test taker. And then lastly, we can sign all the items off, we sign those tests off, and then they are delivered. And that's where they go online, and that's where the test taker can take them in the test center or at home. And I've laid this out as a linear process, moving from one stage to the other, but it's actually a cycle. And very often we're getting feedback that comes back to the writers. If they're writing more items in the future, what have we learned? How can we improve these items? So there's continual feedback all the way through this process to ensure that our items are good quality, they're reliable, they're valid, and that they're fair for those test takers. I'm now going to move on to talk about the different item types that we have in the test. And some of these you would have seen in the second webinar that we had, but some of them I don't think were shown. So we'll go through the test, and I'll just talk a little bit about what the item types are doing, what skills are they assessing, what's important. We'll see some examples of the different item types as well. So there are two sections in the test, and there is an optional 10-minute break in the middle of the test. Section 1 is speaking and listening, and section 2 is reading and writing. There are 13 different item types in the test. But the exact number of item types and the list of, or the actual questions included will depend on the level. So not all tests will have all 13, and all those details are available in the test documents that will be shared. There's a mix of single and integrated skills. So some questions will be looking just at speaking or just reading. And others will be testing a mix where you might get a listening and a reading question, or you might get a reading and a writing question. That integrated skills does two things. One, it's much closer to what test takers, what students will be doing in the real world. You're having a conversation with someone, you are listening and you are speaking at the same time. So we wanted to make sure that the test reflected that real life use. And secondly, because they're integrated, we can make the test a bit shorter. Because we are testing two skills at once, that means the overall test length can be less. Now I said at the top of the page, we have speaking and listening and then reading and writing. Because it is integrated skills, it's not an exact division. So you may get some, well, you will have some reading in section 1. You have to read the question, for example. But there will be some reading. There could also be some writing in section 1. But broadly, the focus in that first section will be speaking and listening, and the focus in the second section will be reading and writing. Throughout the test, we have clear instructions. So at the very beginning, we take test takers through the structure of the test, how long it will take them. We provide guidelines on, for example, using a good headset, making sure that you have a good microphone as well. We also provide guidelines on the layout of the test. Where can they see the timer? Where can they access the notepad? And then before each section, we tell them what's going to be coming up in the test. So these are the items, these are the questions that you'll be seeing. Before each question type, we give them a reminder of the instructions. This is what you'll have to do in the next set of questions. And then on each screen, again, the instructions are at the top. So it's very clear for a test taker what they have to do for each of the questions. Before we move into looking at the details of the different items, I wanted to talk a little bit about the principles that we follow when we are writing items. And if you're a teacher, many of these will be familiar to you. You know, if you deliver tests in classes, in your classroom, a lot of these will be familiar. The first thing is that our items are communicative. All our item types present language in a context, which means we're not testing grammar rules or knowledge of particular vocab. We assess grammar and we assess vocab, but we do that in a context. So that might mean if they might have to describe an image, describe a picture. We'll be assessing grammar and vocab as part of that, but we're not testing knowledge of grammatical rules, for example. We include things like conversations. Again, this is something that students and test takers will be experiencing in the real world. The second thing is integrated skills, which I mentioned. So we want to reflect what test takers will be doing in the real world. They will be listening and speaking. They'll be reading and writing at the same time. So we wanted to include that in our item types. Authentic. We have used a large number of authentic texts, particularly in the reading. So we've gone to newspapers, magazines, websites. We've taken authentic texts that will reflect what they actually see in the real world and use those in the test. And that comes back again to that communicative idea that we want this test to be something relevant and useful to test takers. The fourth point here, varied formats. So we want different ways for them to respond to questions. We've got written responses, we've got spoken responses, we've got sort of multiple choice responses. Again, we want a range so that we're not favoring one particular skill, we're not favoring one particular test taker. If they're very good at writing, that's good, they get the opportunity to show that, but we need to assess across the whole range of skills. Varied stimuli, again, we've used lots of different types of text, lots of different types of listening. They might hear stories, they might hear descriptions, or they might have to write an explanation or write an argument in an essay, so that they are given the opportunity to demonstrate all their skills in English. Varied task types, again, they'll need to do different things. So they might be doing a global listening. What's their overall understanding of what they've just heard? Or they might do very detailed listening, focusing on the the specific details of a listening, and the same for reading as well. There might be global reading questions, there could be detailed reading questions. They might have to give very short spoken responses and also extended spoken responses. So we are testing their full ability, their full range of English. Washback. Now, washback can be positive or negative, and any assessment should have ideally positive washback. And what this means is the assessment has a good influence on what they're doing in the classroom or what they're doing in their everyday life. So we want to make sure that the test is a good reflection of what they are studying in class, or how they're having to use English in the real world. What we don't want is test takers having to spend hours and hours and hours preparing for an exam, which has no relevance to the English that they've been doing in class or that they've been using when they're out and about. So positive washback essentially, does it have a good influence on their learning of English? The 8th point here is graphics. Particularly for lower levels, we've included lots of images, lots of graphics, because that requires less processing for lower levels. We didn't want to overwhelm learners at A1 and A2 with too much text. Where possible, we've included graphics. For example, multiple choice, they see 3 images. And I'll show you some examples of that as we go through the test. And then lastly, we wanted to avoid bias. And this could be cultural bias. You don't need to know about a particular country to take this test. You don't need to know about the UK or the US or any country in particular. But also, we want to make sure that you don't need to know about a topic to answer the question. We're not testing knowledge of a topic, we're testing knowledge of English. So all our questions are checked against this to ensure that you can answer the question from the information that's in front of you or that you hear, rather than your background knowledge. And again, we'll see some examples of that as we go through the items. Now I'm going to go through some of the items, some of the examples of item types that we have. And these are all in the order of the test that the test takers will see when they sit the international certificate. The first question type that they will see is the read aloud. And students will be given a short text. You can see on screen here. And I will show you a zoomed in version of this in a minute. They see a short text and they have to read that out loud. They'll be given some time to read through that text and prepare. They can even practice quietly to themselves. And then the microphone will come on and they read this aloud. And this is assessing pronunciation and fluency, but also reading. So it's a really good example of that integrated skills I was talking about. So they have to be able to understand, they have to be able to read that as well as say it. And this is quite a nice item type to start with, because it's something that we all do, we all read. They don't have to think too much. They just have to focus on producing that language. They're not having to think of the language themselves. It's there on screen for them to read. Hopefully that's a slightly bigger version for you so you can see the kind of thing that they will have to be reading. Obviously at the lower levels, we use simpler vocabulary and they have to read slightly shorter text. At the higher levels, the text becomes more complex vocabulary, more complex grammar, and also becomes slightly longer. But as I say, they will have time to prepare, and then the microphone will open. They will know the microphone opens because they hear a beep, and that again gives you a sign, okay, now I can start speaking. Second item type that they will see is the listen and repeat. So they will hear a short sentence, then the microphone will open and they repeat that sentence. And this is testing listening comprehension at the word and sentence level. So again, things like pronunciation and fluency. They have to be able to understand that sentence so they can repeat it. And because they are speaking, again, it's assessing the speaking. So another really good example of integrated skills. Hopefully you could hear that. That was an example of the kind of sentence that they will hear, and then they will need to repeat. This is the third item type that they will see in the exam. And this is more of an open-ended question. So the previous two were quite controlled. They're either given the text to read, or they hear the text and repeat it. This one, they're given an image, and they have to describe it. And again, they're given some preparation time to think about what's important in this image. What should I be talking about? They can make some notes on that. And then the microphone will open and they can start talking about it. So in this kind of item, we're looking at extended speaking. So can they link their ideas together? Can they use connectors? We're also obviously assessing pronunciation and fluency, stress, all those other aspects that are important in speaking, as well as your appropriate use of grammar and appropriate vocabulary. We've included a range of different images. Some of them will be authentic, some of them will be commissioned, like this one is. So we would ask someone to actually create this image for us. All the images are culturally appropriate, so you don't need to know about a particular country to understand what's happening in the image. They should all be familiar to test takers. Again, we won't ask test takers to describe something that they have never seen before. So, and that's to make this test fair for everybody. This test is a global test, and so will be taken by people all around the world, and we need to ensure that it's going to be fair for all of those test takers. The fourth item type is listen to a conversation. Again, if we think back to those principles we were talking about at the beginning, a really good example of communicative English. This is something that they will be doing in everyday life, listening to a conversation, participating in a conversation. They'll need to understand, and this is, again, focused on listening. They need to give a spoken response, but the primary focus here is on listening to that short conversation and then answering a short question. The questions could focus on general global understanding. It could be something like, where are the speakers? And you have to understand the whole conversation to work out, well, they're in a shop or they're in a hospital. Or it might be focusing on the details. What did she, or where did she want to go, for example? And that would be focusing on the detail. So we include a range of different questions within this question type to test their detailed listening, but also their global listening. You can hear an example now.
Hi, Ben. We can't hear the audio examples that you're playing, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's a shame. Okay, that's... Let me see if I can fix that.
Hi, Ben. This is fascinating stuff you're sharing with us. I think if you click, when you click share and you click this share sound box, that should take care of it.
Hopefully it's fixed now.
Hello, do you sell envelopes? I need to post this letter.
We do, yes. Do you need any stamps as well?
Thanks, but I've already got one.
What does the woman want to buy?
Sophia, would you better confirm? Did you hear that?
Yes, we did. Thank you so much, Ben.
All right, so I won't put you on the spot and ask you what you wanted to buy, but it was envelopes, and that's a good example of testing that detail. Okay, so you have to listen to the whole conversation and then answer that question. Okay, the fifth item type that we've got is passage comprehension. And this is an example of where we have slightly different question types depending on the level of the test. So I mentioned at the beginning about we wanted to include more drawings and graphics for lower level test takers. And this is an example of where for A1 and A2, they hear a short passage and then they need to answer a question, but they choose from 3 graphical options, as you can see here. So again, this is very much focused on listening comprehension, and similar to the last item type that we learned that we were looking at. It could be global understanding, or it could be more detailed understanding, or it could be an understanding of that context, where this conversation or where this passage is taking place. So if we listen to the prompt, this is the kind of thing that they will hear.
I'd like an orange juice with ice, please. To start, I think I'll have a sandwich with egg. No, wait. I'll have a cheese one with tomato. After, I'd like some fresh fruit and ice cream.
Okay, so that's what they'll hear, and then the question will follow, which is this.
What is the man doing?
I'd like an
What
orange
is the
juice.
man?
And if I pull that up, you can see the images. Hopefully they're a bit bigger now. The question was, what is the man doing? And this is a good example of that context kind of question. So we're not asking for the details of what did he want to eat, but we're trying to get a general understanding of where is he, or what is he doing right now? And the answer is obviously he's ordering in the restaurant. So we have first image there. He's not eating, although he will be, and he's not paying. Again, hopefully he will be eventually. So that's an example of passage comprehension for the A1 and A2 tests.
What?
For B1 and above, they have slightly different question. So they'll hear the same thing. They'll hear a passage. They'll have to answer 3 questions, but this time they give a spoken response. They're not choosing from an image. So this is testing listening comprehension again, but also speaking. And we can hear an example of this.
Pauline went to the theater with her sister to see a musical called Bright Lights. In the interval, they went to buy ice cream, and while they were standing in the queue, they heard someone say, "Hello, Pauline." It was an old school friend who Pauline hadn't seen for a very long time. Pauline was very happy to see her.
Okay, so as I say, that's for a slightly higher level. You can tell that the language is slightly more difficult. And then this is the question.
Who went to the theatre with Pauline?
And hopefully you got the answer, his sister. Now with this kind of question, we're not going to be testing them on facts. Okay, so we focus very much on understanding and comprehension. They won't need to remember exactly how much something cost or the name of a place. It's more on what was your understanding of what you just heard. You can see the difference between the lower level where the multiple choice choosing an image versus the higher level where they need to give a short spoken response. And it can be very short. You know, sister would be fine. She went with her sister would be fine as well. They don't need to give a full, long, detailed answer to that question. Moving on to the next listening and writing item is dictation. And this is one that will be familiar to you, I'm sure. You've either used it in your classroom or you would have seen it in the paper-based test. So they will hear a short sentence, short text, and we'll write it down in the text box at the bottom. So this is testing listening comprehension at the word and sentence level, but also obviously writing. So again, a good example of integrated skills. They'll need to understand the meaning of that sentence. They need to understand sentence structure, word order, connectors, and spelling is also important. So we can hear an example of the kind of thing that they will listen to.
I cannot find my glasses.
I cannot find my glasses, and it will write that in the box. We won't be asking them to spell unusual names or any names, in fact, or abbreviations or very obscure words that they might not have seen before. Again, we're not trying to trick test takers. It's got to be something that they will encounter in the real world. It's got to be authentic. It's got to be fair. In this kind of item type, when they are writing American or British spelling, it's fine. We're not focused on a particular form of English. And this item type is seen in all the tests from A1 up to C2. But obviously at the higher levels, it's a longer text, longer sentence that they hear, and more complex grammar and more complex vocabulary. Last item in the first section, so this is our listening and speaking section, is hotspot. And this is where they hear a short text and they also read a short text on screen. Most of the texts are the same. So what they see on screen is more or less the same as what they hear, except there are some critical differences. 4 or 5 words will be different. And what they'll need to do as they're listening is they need to identify which words are different to what they heard. And we can have a look at an example. So that's the text. And this is what they will hear.
Sam is a young man. He lives in a small house in a big city. Every day he goes to work by bus. He works in a restaurant. In the evening, he likes to play football in the garden with his friends.
So you'll see that Sam is a young boy. What we heard was Sam is a young man. So they'll need to click on boy to say, well, that's the different word. Now, when we design this item, when we write this item, we obviously need to make sure that what you see on screen, the text here, still makes sense. Sam is a young boy is possible. That's perfectly fine. What we don't want is to make it easy for test takers to guess. If it was Sam is a young cat, for example, that would obviously be wrong, and you could very easily you wouldn't even need to listen. You just click on that word and say, well, that's clearly wrong. So the text that you see on screen has to make sense, but it's different when you actually come to hear the listening. That brings us to the end of section 1. And as I say, normally you'd have the option of a 10-minute break in the test if you want to take that. And then you move into the reading and writing section. And again, this is another example of where we have slightly different questions for different levels. So at the higher levels, so B1 and above, there is a reading comprehension. Very familiar to test takers. They would have seen this kind of question before. They're given a text. This is all authentic text. Okay, so these have come from newspapers, magazines, and websites, and so on. And 4 questions. And they need to give a written response to those 4 questions based on details in the text. The texts are obviously more difficult at the higher levels, more complex vocabularies, more difficult questions, but all focused on the details of that text. If we move on to the next screen, I've zoomed in a bit and get an example of the kinds of questions that we'll be asking and the kinds of text that we'll be seeing. And they should use no more than 3 words when it comes to answering this question. Question 1, what job is available? Food delivery assistance. Question 2, when will new employees learn how to do the job? Late August. Just at the end of that first paragraph. So that's an example of a reading question for higher levels. For lower levels, again, they get a text and they have a question, but this time we're giving them graphical multiple choice, similar to what we were doing with the listening. So they'll read a short text and then choose the best image, the correct image to answer the question. So we're testing understanding of perhaps short messages, notes, short pieces of writing, again, trying to make these as authentic as possible. We'll zoom in a bit so you can have a look at the text and the three options. The question is, what is the correct picture for the shop? And the first image at the top there, apples, bananas, and strawberries. And this kind of question, as I said, is for A1 and A2. Another type of reading question is the capsule. And this is for all levels, so from A1 to C2. They'll read a short text with a missing word or a missing phrase, short phrase, 2, 3, 4 words, and they have to choose what would go in that gap. And this is focused on global understanding, so they need to read the whole text to get the answer right, rather than details of the text that we saw in previous questions. Again, all of this should be sort of public information, things that they will see in the real world. Is either authentic or written as if it is authentic, and only one option is correct. Zoom in a bit so you can see that. Stairs closed, use the something to go to the second floor. Gate, stairs, and elevator, they're all possible, but based on our understanding and reading that full text, elevator would be the correct answer. Two more items to look at. The first is the passage recall, and this is a reading and a writing integrated skills task. So test takers will see a short text. It's a story, so it has that narrative structure. Something happens, there's an introduction, something happens, and then there's a conclusion. And they see that text for 30 seconds, it then disappears. And they have to reconstruct that text based on their understanding. Now, it's important to say that we don't expect them, or we don't need them to reconstruct the text word for word. We're not asking them to memorize exactly what they saw and write that down. That's impossible for anyone. What we're asking them to do is to reconstruct it, so making sure that they're focused on comprehension. What was the purpose of the story? Who were the people in the story? What did they do? Where did they go? And then using their knowledge of writing, so grammar and vocab and word structure and sentence structure, reconstruct that. And if they can do that, they'll do very well in this item. So I think if you're preparing test takers or a test taker yourself, it's important that you don't focus on memorizing this, you focus on the comprehension, what happened in that story. And then you can reconstruct it in your own words. And as long as you demonstrate that you've understood the story, then you will do very well in this item type. Have a closer look at that. Mary loves to take photographs. One day she decided to go to the park, take photographs of the birds there. When she got there, she found her camera wasn't working. She was not very happy. So you could retell that story. Mary enjoys using her camera, for example. We'll be fine. You're communicating that story. The last item type that we have is the short writing task. And this again varies depending on which level you're taking. So if you're taking A1 and A2, we ask test takers to describe an image. So we give them an image similar to what they were doing in the speaking, and they have 9 minutes to write at least 25 words about this image. We're testing paragraph and sentence structure as part of this item type. the range and accuracy of their grammar and vocab. Can they structure and can they connect sentences and ideas together? And we're also testing grammar and vocabulary. But for the A1 and A2 test takers, they will describe that image, and that image should be familiar to them. There won't be anything new or unexpected in those images. At the B1 and above exams, we give them an essay prompt, which again would be something that they're familiar with, they would have done in class many times. So it gives them a prompt, an essay prompt, and they write their response to that, and they give them 10 minutes to write their answer to that essay. And again, we're looking at the same thing, so paragraph and sentence structure, knowledge, or range and accuracy of grammar and vocabulary. These topics will be general interest. Again, they don't need any specialist knowledge to answer these topics. Should be things that they are familiar with, be asking them for an opinion about, but they don't require any kind of background knowledge or expertise to answer these questions. And when they're writing their answer, they'll see a word count on screen. One of the advantages of doing this online is that you can use things like a word count so that they can focus on producing good English, good language, and not worry too much about how many words have I written so far. They can also use that to plan out their essay and think about the ideas that they want to include in their essay. And that brings us to the end of the different item types. You can see we've got a whole range of item types covering all the different skills. Some are integrated, some are focused on one particular skill. We've got things testing on details, we've got things testing global understanding, we've got short responses, we've got more longer open-ended responses, so that we are covering that full range of English, testing the full range of communicative language that they will need. So I'm just going to wrap up by talking about test scoring and reporting. So one of the advantages of computer-based tests is that we can do very quick score turnarounds, which means you get your results that much quicker. Now, some of the items can be scored as you're taking the test. So if you think about your multiple choice questions that we saw, the hotspot questions, they can all be scored as part of the test. There is a right and a wrong answer, so very quickly, very easily scored. But if we think about the more open-ended questions, things like the writing the essay, the short writing task, or describing the image, these are much more open-ended. There are lots of right answers. So we need a different approach to scoring for these item types. And we can either use human raters to score those responses, or we can use AI and machine computer-based scoring to score those responses. So at launch for International Certificate, we're using human raters to score those open-ended items. And those raters, those markers, are using very detailed descriptors to help them when it comes to scoring the items, scoring the responses. So they're given detailed training, they're given very detailed descriptors which lay out exactly what performance looks like at the different levels. So an A1 candidate, what kinds of grammar will they be producing? What kind of vocab, what kind of structure should we be looking for at that level? They go through lots of training, lots of practice to make sure that they are using those descriptors accurately. And they're also monitored as they go through and score tests to ensure that our scores are reliable and that we are confident with the scores that we're reporting. We also have machine scoring, and Pearson does this for a lot of assessments. So Pearson Test of English Academic, for example, uses machine scoring. And this takes thousands of responses from around the world and uses those responses to create scoring models so that items can be machine scored or computer scored. As I say, we do this with lots of different tests. The important thing here is that we are training computers to score in the same way as humans. So we take all the responses that are rated by humans and we use those responses and we use those ratings to train our computer to say, this is how a human rates, this is how we want the computer to rate. And that's a key thing. Okay, so we're using those human ratings and scores to train up the computer. But because it is computer-based, we can do this on a global scale. So we get consistency. The computer will score the same response in the same way every single time. Speed, you can do this very, very quickly, and there's no bias. So it's treated fairly and equally. And so you get, and that means you can get your scores that much quicker. And eventually, international certificate will be moving to that machine scoring. But the key thing here is to understand that we're basing this on human raters. And as I said, they're using their descriptors, and they go through lots of training and monitoring to ensure that all our scores are valid and reliable. And once the tests have been scored and marked, we process those results, check them, you will then get the test taker will get their score report. They will get a score out of 100, and they will also get a test status. So it could be pass, merit, distinction, depending how they've done. For each skill, and this is a great advantage of the computer-based test, is that they will get a lot of detail about how they're performing. So for each skill, we'll give them a description of this is what your current ability is in listening and speaking and writing and reading. They will also get a set of recommendations. So if they took the B2 test and they've passed, fantastic. Okay, so here's what you need to do next. Here's what you should be doing in the next 6 months. If you've taken the B2 test, you might want to be taking the C1 test in a year's time, in 2 years' time. Here's what you need to do well in the next level. And we also link those recommendations to a range of Pearson courseware titles. So if they're using a particular book in class or the self-study, they will get specific recommendations, and it's really detailed. It's Unit 6, Exercise 3 is going to help you improve and get ready. If they've taken the test and they've failed, their first question will be, what do I need to do to pass next time? And again, our recommendations will help with that. Here's where your strengths are, here are your weaknesses, here's what we recommend you should be working on next to pass next time. So we give you a score, we certify you, but also we want to ensure that as you go forward, you are continuously improving and developing your English. And so it's a really positive experience for test takers. Okay, so that was the end of the presentation, but I'd like to open up to questions. I'm going to have a look at the Q&A. See what we've got here. Oh, I can see someone's been busy with answering a lot of the questions. Thank you. Thanks, Carmen.
That's fascinating, Ben. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. One of the questions that we had was, how long does it take the process of the item creations you were describing?
Yeah, good question. It really depends on the numbers, but I would say sort of 3 to 6 months to do the first kind of initial item writing and review. And then the whole process of producing media and so on, and publishing the test and so on takes a whole lot longer, but sort of 3 to 6 months to actually write the items at the beginning and review them and sign them off.
Thank you. Another question we have is, how long will students have in each section, and if they will know?
Yeah, they will know. So, I've said at the beginning of the test, they will be told how long the test is and how long they have for each section. So, and that will be a range. So they'll be told you have 40 to 50 minutes for section 1. And the reasons it's a range is because different items have slightly different timings. So, but yes, it will be clear to them. The other thing I should say as well is that all the timing is displayed on screen so they can see how long they have for an item, how long they've got in a section, and that's all very clear and upfront so that they're not going to be suddenly taken to the next screen without warning.
Thank you. Somebody's asking if we pre-test items.
Yeah, we do some kind of pre-testing. So you're aware at the moment that we're going through a beta phase of the test, and that's to ensure that our item, the outcomes of the computer-based test are the same as the outcomes for the paper-based test. So that's a critical piece there. We want to make sure that if you pass at B1 on the computer-based, you'll also get a pass on the paper-based test. So that's the kind of pre-testing that we are doing. But we also do ongoing monitoring of items to make sure that the standards are maintained once the test has been launched. I mentioned the calibration as well that we do of items. So there's a whole lot of monitoring and constant checking that the tests and the items are performing as we expect.
Fantastic, thank you. And then we've gotten a number of questions about preparation material. So I think I will help you with that one. Yes, we have preparation material, and we have an assortment of free and paid resources for you to help your students familiarize themselves with the item types. You can download the warm-up app available for Apple and Android, and it has items from the computer-based test. You can also get a set of lesson plans focused on each item type, so you can incorporate this into everyday instruction. And if you want to have the certainty of whether your candidates are ready or not to take the test, we have paid product, which is a readiness test. And you'll get more information about our preparation resources in the follow-up email. And I don't think we have any more questions at this moment. Thank you so much for this, Ben. This has been brilliant. Thank you for sharing.
No worries, and thank you everyone for joining. I hope that was useful. And yeah, thank you very much for your time.